So, as we listed, the tension between Russia and the West is high right now. And first because the conflict of Ukraine, and then the airstrikes in Syria. That's what we know. But I would like to know, from your point of view, what is the exact cause of this tension? And what went wrong between the West and the Russia? You know, like more than 2 decades after the Cold War.
Well, in my view, what went wrong is the policy of the West. Actually, the policy of the West during recent years, or during the period after the Cold War, has been aimed, in to our estimation, aimed at trying to push Russia on the sidelines, on the margins of the world politics, and was aimed at maintaining Western predominance in world affairs, completely ignoring the objective trend of emerging polycentric, multipolar world order. And this is exactly the deep reason, deep root of what is happening now. You mentioned Ukraine and Syria in your question. What happened in Ukraine exactly 2 years ago? In Ukraine, in Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine, an armed, bloody coup d'etat sponsored by the United States and the West took place. And as a result of this coup d'etat, a legitimate president and legitimate government of Ukraine were toppled. And the West tried to accuse Russia of what Russia hasn't done. For example, military interference in Ukraine, aggression in Ukraine, etc., etc. What was done in Ukraine that time was a West-sponsored armed coup d'etat, which resulted in toppling legitimate leader of Ukraine. Of course, Russia condemned strongly this coup d'etat, and Russia expected the West would not interfere with the domestic affairs of Ukraine. But it was done, regretfully. Then you mentioned about airstrikes in Syria, or, to be correct, anti-terrorist operation of the Russian airspace force in Syria by the request of the legitimate government of this country. So why should it be a reason for worsening relations between Russia and Syria and the West? But from the Western point of view, as far as I understand, Russia has done anything wrong. Though Russia, unlike the West, is bombing terrorist facilities in Syria by the request of its legitimate government. And at the same time, the West, the US-led coalition, has been bombing Syria without any request and without any sanction, neither from the legitimate government of Syria nor from the United Nations Security Council. So what really went wrong is the policy of the West.
But you mentioned that the policy of the West tried to push Russia on the sidelines. I mean, particularly Russia. Why? Why Russia?
Because
that means that the West see Russia as a big potential threat for them. I mean, why they particularly targeted Russia?
Well, I think this question, it's better to address this question, it's better to ask this question to the ambassadors of Western states here in Jakarta about why they are trying to push Russia in the margins of the world politics, why they are trying to isolate Russia, etc., etc. My view is that the West doesn't like independent foreign policy of Russia. Policy of strict observation of international law, policy of respect for rightful interests of sovereign states, policy which is aimed at equal dialogue and equal rights with regard to the solution of acute international issues, policy which is aimed at the respect for the central role of the United Nations and international law and the Charter of the United Nations. For example, and at the same time, the West is doing what it's doing. For example, we see in recent years, we have seen many cases, many examples of how the West, violating international law, made interference with the domestic affairs of sovereign states, like former Yugoslavia, like bombings of former Yugoslavia, like bombings in Libya, like bombings in Iraq. And all these actions taken in violation of international law, taken without any sanction or any permission by the UN Security Council, meant use of force, unlawful use of force in international relations. And these actions resulted in regime change in sovereign states and further chaos, which was brought by this use of force without permission of the United Nations. Just look what is happening now in Libya. Just look what is happening now in Syria. Just look what is happening in Iraq. In these countries, in these countries, state institutions were destroyed, and as a result of the Western interference, and this vacuum of power was filled by the terrorists, by the extremists, which we now, and its criminal activity we are witnessing in the form of criminal activity of so-called Islamic State.
Okay, but several media have reported.
That's what we oppose. We are opposing strongly to this policy, and West doesn't like it. And one more example is enlargement of NATO bloc, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, further to the east, to the Russian borders, in violation of the promises given by the Western leadership to the leadership of the former Soviet Union and Russian Federation, that NATO won't be enlarged to the east, that NATO won't expand its military infrastructure closer to the Russian borders. Now these promises are ignored and violated.
But back in Ukraine and also in Syria, the media have long reported that they have evidence that there are military equipment from Russia in East Ukraine, or in case of Syria, media have also long reported there's, the airstrikes, the Russia airstrike in Syria have resulted in numerous of civil casualties. How do you respond to these allegations?
Yes, we have responded for many times through many Western media. Well, unfortunately, we are not maybe heard properly by the Western officials, by the Western governments, by the Western leadership and by the Western media, maybe. Well, first of all, as far as we know, we do not send any troops to the eastern part of Ukraine. First of all, you mentioned Russian-made equipment or something, military equipment in the eastern part of Ukraine. But as far as we know, all the weapons used by the Ukrainian citizens who did not agree with the military coup d'etat in Kiev and were forced by the Kiev government, who illegally seized power 2 years ago in Kiev, were forced to protest using arms. And as far as we know, these arms, these military equipment, is a military equipment of Ukrainian armed forces, of Ukrainian police, Ukrainian security services that were in storage in the eastern part of Ukraine, and that is all. And all these weapons, yes, it's maybe Soviet-made or maybe Russian-made, because the Ukrainian government army, police and security forces, they do use Soviet-made and Russian-made equipment, mainly Soviet-made, I think. So that is the arms the Ukrainian citizens in Donbass are fighting, had to fight against their own government, because the government that does not really take into account their legitimate interests. That is the cause of the whole crisis in Ukraine. If you forgot it, I can remind you that when 2 years ago an armed coup d'etat took place in Kiev, what was done by the perpetrators of this coup d'etat? First of all, completely violating agreement between Yanukovych and opposition signed in Kiev in February 2014, instead of creation of a government of national unity, which, as it was stipulated by the above-mentioned agreement between the government and opposition, sponsored, by the way, by the foreign ministers of several Western states, they created a government, what they call a government of winners. And one of the first political actions of these so-called government of winners was to prohibit the use of Russian language as a regional language in Ukraine. So it caused great split in the Ukrainian society, including Crimea, which population did not agree with such a policy and rejoined finally Russia. And it caused also dissatisfaction and opposition in the eastern part of Ukraine, mainly populated by ethnic Russians. So that was the cause of this, that was the main reason of what is happening now. And instead of dialogue with the Ukrainian citizens living in the eastern part of Ukraine, the Ukrainian government started what it calls anti-terrorist operation. So they just labeled their own citizens who did not agree with the illegitimate coup d'etat in the capital of the country. They are labeling them as terrorists and use force against them. Would you believe it? They even use air force against citizens of their own country. Would you believe it? Now, fortunately, Minsk agreements are concluded, and the problem is to implement Minsk agreements. And many things, many steps, and main steps should be done by the Kiev government, like adoption of an amnesty law, like adoption of legislation on permanent status of certain districts of Lugansk and Donetsk regions of Ukraine, like constitutional reform, which would be agreed upon with the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. It is not done by the Ukrainian side. And by the way, Minsk agreements clearly say that the restoration of control of the Ukrainian government over the border between Russia and Ukraine in Donbass will be implemented after all the above-mentioned measures were taken by the Kiev government. So it is the Kiev government who should implement Minsk agreements, not Russia. For example, is it possible for Russia? Is Russia capable of approving an amnesty law for Ukraine? No. The Western media, the Western authorities, they give, to put it mildly, incorrect information about Russia's position towards Ukraine. And by the way, Minsk agreements also stipulate that all foreign militants should be withdrawn from Ukraine. And we know that there are militants in Ukraine on the side of the Kiev government from various countries, including Lithuania, including Poland, including Georgia, etc., etc. Please.
About Syria.
Casualties, yeah.
Russian airstrikes in Syria.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Russian airspace forces are conducting their operation in Syria by the request of the legitimate government of the country. It is the greatest distinction of Russian operation in Syria and operation of the U.S.-led coalition, who is bombing Syria without request, without permission of the legitimate government of the country. That's first point. Second is that we are never given any proof, any evidence of civilian casualties or civilian facilities destruction as a result of the airstrikes of Russian airspace force. For example, a week ago, the Western media broadly reported that Russian airspace force bombed hospitals in some Syrian cities, hospitals of the international organization Médecins Sans Frontières. But first of all, it was not proven by clear evidence. My colleagues in Geneva contacted with the Médecins Sans Frontières headquarters and representatives, and they said they had no reason to criticize Russia about that. It's first point. Second is that we bomb in Syria only terrorist facilities, terrorist personnel, terrorist training camps, terrorist equipment storages, and routes and means of illegal oil exports of ICs through Turkey. That's what we bomb on the Syrian territory.
But you also not only bombing, ISIS.
Yeah, we also bomb.
The terrorists. What do you mean terrorists by Assad's term, which is also including the moderate forces that's been fighting Assad since 2011?
We respect international law, and that is why we bomb terrorists who are qualified as such, who are qualified by terrorists by the United Nations Security Council, namely ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, and other terrorist groups affiliated with ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. That's first point. Then we verify targets collecting intelligence from various sources. First of all, from the information centers we established in Baghdad and Amman, together with Iraqi, Iranian, and Jordanian colleagues. Then we have satellite intelligence, and we have intelligence from Syrian government troops, and we have intelligence from patriotic opposition that may be against Bashar al-Assad's government, but it is apparently against terrorists. And only after having verified this information, this intelligence, we conduct airstrikes. But moreover, every day, Russian Defense Ministry holds briefings for foreign media and foreign military attaches in Moscow. And during these briefings, on everyday basis, we provide detailed information about what, where, and how we bombed on this or that day. So the international community has clear information about what we are doing. And at the same time, look at the activity of the US-led coalition. That is the United States and their allies who bomb civilian targets. I can give you only one one information from Air Wars Monitor Group. It's an NGO who said that since the US-led coalition started its bombings in Syria since September 2014, approximately 2,000 of civilians were killed by the strikes of the US-led coalition. So apparently all these speculations about civilian casualties as a result of the Russian airstrikes are groundless, are completely groundless and false.
But now there's an agreement made
Yes.
between US and Russia to stop their airstrikes. It should be implemented, if I'm not mistaken, next Friday. Next Friday. How do you see the end of conflict in Syria? I mean, there's a lot of accusations that Russia wants Bashar al-Assad still lead the country after the political resolutions and all, but how do you respond?
What Russia wants is to see peace in Syria, is to see political transition in Syria implemented by Syrians themselves without any interference. Russia,
is that possible?
We think so. You mean what? Political transition without interference?
Yeah.
If the Western countries,
even from Bashar al-Assad forces.
if Western countries do not interfere with Syrian domestic affairs, nobody will do. Up to now.
About Bashar al-Assad, I mean, people are actually against him. That's what makes this all happening now from 2011.
Have you interviewed the whole Syrian people to judge that Syrian people is against Bashar al-Assad?
Yeah, no, what I mean is there's this movement from Russian people in 2011 that actually
Russian people?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, from the recent Syrian people in a lot of part in Syria that actually lead to the situation now. So there's a problem in Syria, and a lot of also groups who want Assad to step down at the moment.
Yes, yes. There are some groups who want that Assad step down at the moment. It is naive logic to think that once Bashar Assad steps down, everything will return to normalcy in Syria. It's very naive logic. We have been told for many times by our Western partners that once Gaddafi stepped down, there will be democracy in Libya. Now we see that there is no statehood in Libya, finally. But Gaddafi not only stepped down, but he was killed by, by the Western strikes, as far as I understand. The West tried to persuade us that once Saddam Hussein steps down, there will be democracy in Iraq. We see what is happening in Iraq. We do not see the same scenario in Syria, because the Western interference, armed interference in Libya and Iraq, and now in Syria, resulted in ISIS criminal activity, because the vacuum of power created by the Western interference in Iraq and Libya and partly in Syria, partially in Syria, was filled by extremists and terrorists, whom we have to fight together now. That is why what we want to see in Syria is, first of all, ceasefire, cessation of hostilities. And we value very highly our agreement with the United States of America, reached on the 22nd of February, about the modalities of the cessation of hostilities. And we hope that all parties concerned, I mean the government of Syria, legitimate government of Syria, and opposition will follow these terms of cessation of hostilities agreed upon between Russia and the United States of America. As you know, the cessation of the cessation of military operation won't include terrorist groups like ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, and others who were identified as terrorist groups by the UN Security Council resolutions. This first point. If there is a cessation of hostility in Syria, it will greatly reverse the whole situation in this country, because very good conditions for peaceful political transition will be created. What do we mean by a peaceful political transition? It is all written in the Vienna documents of international group of Syrian support for Syria, and as you know, these provisions includes direct dialogue between Syrian government and Syrian opposition about the modalities of political transition period, which should be resulted in creation in adoption of a new constitution of Syria, in creation of a new government, in election of a president, etc., etc. So we do not support any political force in Syria, including President Bashar Assad. We are dealing with the legitimate government of Syria. As you understand, it is quite different from what the West say about Russian position. We think that it is up to Syrians to decide whether Bashar Assad should step down or not. There are forces in Syria who want to see Bashar Assad step down. There are forces in Syria and people, citizens in Syria, who do not want Bashar Assad to step down. And let's not label all the Syrian population as the opposition to the Bashar Assad. Situation is much more complex than you have described in your question. So what we think is that Syria should be a united, sovereign, secular state where all nations, all confessions would live in peace, safety, with dignity, together with each other. That's what we want to see in Syria.
True that the legitimate government in Syria asked for Russian help to launch the airstrikes in Syria. But why is Russia willing to interfere in Syria's conflict? America has been long as, they claim themselves the police of the world actually, and the Western and the Arab countries who actually help join the US-led coalitions also probably have the motives about Sunni government and Shiite government in Syria. They have also interest. But what is Russia's interest in Syria? Why do you want to interfere?
First of all, we do not interfere. Again, let's be correct in using language. We are conducting anti-terrorist operation in Syria by the request of the legitimate government of that country. It's not interference. Interference is something which is done without any request, without any permission of the legitimate government of the country, and you are right. That is what the United States-led coalition has been doing up to now. What is the reason for Russian operation, anti-terrorist operation in Syria? First of all, we see the unprecedented growth of terrorist threat from Syrian territory and from Iraq territory, where ISIS created something like pseudo-state, like quasi-state. And this state, so-called state, which has nothing to do with Islam and with the statehood, this so-called state proclaims a very, very dangerous slogan of creation of an Islamic caliphate from Portugal to Pakistan. We have already detected a so-called representative of the ISIS in Afghanistan, which means that they are closer and closer to the Russian borders. At the same time, there are several thousands of Russian citizens who are fighting for ISIS in Syria. And we do not want these criminals, these terrorists, to come back to Russia to continue their activities. And that is why we think that we should be in Syria. We should help Syrian government in eliminating terrorist threat on the Syrian territory. Otherwise, this terrorist threat will be spreading, affecting more and more regions, including Russia. And this is why President Putin, in September 2015, addressing the United Nations General Assembly, proposed to establish a global anti-terrorist coalition under the auspices of the United Nations and on the solid basis of international law. So we do not want to see separate coalitions which actions are not coordinated enough. We want to see global coalition which will be targeted, which will be aimed against terrorists who are identified and who are identified as terrorists in accordance with the decisions of the United Nations Security Council. That's what we want to see. That is why we are in Syria.
How hard do you think it is to battle ISIS? I mean, Israel said that they are just criminals on the trucks. You can actually beat them. Not very long, but how do Russians think?
Well, I don't think.
How hard it is to fight ISIS?
Well, it depends on how united is international community in fighting ISIS. Again, we are disappointed with the activity of the US-led coalition in Syria and Iraq because after a year or maybe 2 years of the activity of the US-led coalition, the so-called Islamic State has expanded its territories, has expanded territory it occupies. And now we see that the Russian airstrikes made by the request of the legitimate government of Syria against ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, which are, by the way, prohibited in Russia, are giving good results because more and more Syrian government forces are advancing. More and more they are liberating the territories that were occupied by the ISIS. That is our estimation, but still the task is very hard. Still, we have together to do a lot to eliminate ISIS.
Okay. So, move to Turkey now. You know, the tension is also not very good. In a low point between Russia and Turkey following the shooting of the jets, Russian jets by the Turkey military. But how do you see the future of the relations between two countries? Do you see any, better conditions in upcoming days,
Well, first of all, what Turkey had done on the 24th of November 2015, I mean hitting Russian jet in Syrian airspace, which was engaged in an anti-terrorist mission in Syria, is a step into the back of Russia. It's an act of treason. It's an act of support for international terrorism. We feel strong outrage and indignation with what Turkish government had done. We strongly demand, first of all, apologies. We demand compensation. We demand punishment of those responsible for hitting our jet and killing two Russian servicemen. We also strongly condemned the support Turkey provides to the terrorists. It is a well-known fact. I don't think it's a secret for CNN that illegal exports of oil illegally drilled by ISIS on occupied terrorists is being conducted through the Turkish territory under the connivance of the Turkish authorities. There is information that the ISIS militants can have a rest in Turkey, can have a treatment in Turkish hospitals, and there is a supply of weaponry, foods, and other stuff for terrorist fighting in Syria from Turkey. So we want Turkey to show responsible approach and to stop these actions, which are in fact supporting terrorists. So Turkey knows very well what to do if it really wants to normalize relations with Russia.
So how do you say it won't be happening in upcoming?
It depends on Turkey. I told you about what we expect from this country.
Okay, so many say also what happens now is the beginning of another Cold War. How do you see that?
Well, first of all, if you think that one more Cold War is going to start, it is going to start not because of some actions taken by Russia. As I told you before, the policy of the West, who is ignoring the polycentric nature of present-day world and trying to preserve by any means, including use of force, its preponderance in global affairs. It's the main reason of the trend you mentioned now. It's a reason for experts, analysts, journalists to say that a new Cold War is starting. Just look what is happening, or what has been happening up to now. Hopefully the West will reconsider its policy. But what has been happening is, first of all, enlargement of North Atlantic Treaty Organization, its expansion closer to Russian borders. Then there is an apparent strategy of the West, led by the United States of America, to gain military superiority over Russia. For example, the clearest example of such a strategy is the activity of the United States and the West to create anti-ballistic missile defense system. which is aimed at Russian strategic potential. The West was trying to persuade us that this ABM system, global system, is aimed against Iranian nuclear and missile potential. But now there is a deal but now there is an agreement which settles the issues related to the Iranian nuclear program. But the global IBM system creation is still underway. That is one more reason for growing military tensions in modern international relations. And then, as I mentioned above, the West is exercising what may be called as social and political engineering in sovereign states, aimed at toppling legitimate government of these sovereign states, I mean the government that are not liked by the West. We have seen it in the former Yugoslavia, we have seen it in Libya, we have seen it in Iraq, we have seen it in Ukraine, now we are seeing it in Syria. Hopefully, the recent agreements between Russia and the United States will lead to a peaceful transition, political transition in Syria. That's what we want. And we hope that the United States and its allies will observe these agreements too. But up to now, the policy of the West was really has been really causing tensions all over the world. And that I think this made you, for example, to ask me a question about a possibility of a new Cold War.
The escalations.
Yeah.
As far as we know that now Russia is under sanctions from the US and also European Union. But what we don't know is how impactful is this sanction to Russian people.
Well, first of all, the sanctions of the West imposed against Russia illegally in violation of all norms of international law and UN Charter are a complete failure. Because, as you know, the main purpose of imposing sanctions against Russia by the West was to force Russia, to make Russia change its policy with regard to Crimea and Ukraine. The policy of Russia with regard to Crimea in Ukraine have not changed at all. That means that the sanctions and isolation policy of the West is a complete failure, because they didn't achieve the goal they have set, imposing sanctions. And they will never achieve this goal, because Russia is not a country who will allow to our partners to speak to us by the language of sanctions, pressure, isolation, etc., etc. That's my first point. The second point is that potential of Russia, economic, scientific resources, intellectual potential, is very, very big, and such country as Russia cannot be dramatically affected by any sanctions from any country. For example, now when we are under sanctions, and first of all, these sanctions are aimed at limitation for Russian industries to have investment resources from the West and banks, etc., etc. Now we, taking into account the plunge of oil and gas prices, we are now modernizing our own industries, our own economics, to make it more high technological, to make it more innovative. And we are doing and we have successful results in modernizing our economy. I mean, first of all, growth of exports of industrial goods from Russia, growth in our agricultural sector. Russia is now regained its position as one of the world's biggest exporters of grain, of wheat, for example. We are world leaders in such high technological spheres as airspace equipment, airspace vehicles, airspace engines. We are one of the world leaders in the area of nuclear power energy, I mean peaceful use of nuclear energy. We are one of the world leaders in manufacturing world-class weaponry, and Indonesia is one of the countries which uses this Russian-made weaponry. So Russia has very huge potential, which cannot be diminished by any sanctions from anybody. And as far as the effect of the sanctions is concerned, I can tell you frankly that, of course, these sanctions are not a pleasure, but they are not a catastrophe for us, not a catastrophe at all. Moreover, these sanctions are harmful for both, for those who are imposed sanctions and for those who are imposing sanctions. For example, now the economics of European countries suffer heavy losses from the prohibition of Russian imports of agricultural goods from the United States and Eurozone. They are suffering losses from the reduction of the Russian tourist flow to the European countries, etc., etc. If they think it is good for them to suffer such losses, okay. We do not have an item of lifting sanctions on our agenda of with the West. It was not Russia who initiated and imposed sanctions. It was the West who initiated and imposed sanctions. And it is up to the West to decide about this. We will never ask them to lift sanctions.
Just this morning, I actually read the news about the U.S. military and intelligence satellite is still using rocket machine from Russia.
Yes, engines, Russian-made engines are used by the United States of America to bring their satellites into the orbits. It's one point. Second point, now only Russia has airspace vehicles to deliver personnel, to deliver crews and equipment and goods to International Space Station. So it is more and more clear. It is clearer and clearer every day that these sanctions imposed by the West against Russia are really artificial. They have no future. They have no result. And quite on the contrary, where and when Russia and the West are acting together, are cooperating on the basis of equality and on the basis of respect of rightful interests of each other, there are very good, very positive results for the international community. Just look how Russia and the United States, under the auspices of the United Nations, have implemented a very important program of chemical demilitarization of Syria. It is a very, very important result of Russian-West collaboration. Then look how important it was to reach agreement on the issues related to the Iranian nuclear program. Again, Russia and the West collaborated in this area as partners, and the international community can see very good result of this collaboration. Recently, A couple of days ago, as you know, Russia and the United States issued a statement on the modalities of cessation of hostilities in Syria. It is one more example of how Russia and the West can fruitfully cooperate for peace and stability and security in the Middle East and globally. So that's the way we should follow, without trying to isolate each other, without trying to impose pressure on each other, without trying to impose any sanctions against each other. I think it is more promising way. I mean, collaboration between Russia and the West. It's a more promising way for all international community. If the West cooperates with Russia, like it cooperated in case of Syrian chemical demilitarization or Iranian nuclear program, you will have no reason to ask me whether Cold War starts or not.
What we don't know also is what happens inside Russia. I mean, regarding to the Crimea, the Ukrainian conflict, or the airstrikes in Syria, how does the people of Russia respond to it? I mean, is there any opposing government decisions to launch the airstrike in Syria? I mean.
Okay, if you want to know what is happening in Russia, if you sincerely want to know what is happening inside Russia, please, the Russian media are at your disposal, and there are many English language media, by the way, and Indonesian language media like Russia Beyond the Headlines. Please, they are very reliable source of information, like Russia Today Television, RT, like TASS News Agency, like Sputnik News Agency, like above mentioned Russia Beyond the Headlines, which is in Bahasa. So there is no lack of information from Russia. There may be lack of interest of some people in the Western media to use these sources of information, frankly. Then Russia is a democratic society, and we have diversity of opinions in our country, diversity of political parties in our country. So, and each of them has different opinion, may have different opinion on this or this domestic or international issues. It's only natural for a democratic society. But I can assure you that the most majority of the Russian public opinion, most majority of the Russian population supports the policy of the government and the President Putin with regard to main international and domestic issues. Now, as far as I understand, support rate of President Putin is the highest, the record highest. It's more than 85%, as far as I understand, which is, you know, very high. Rejoining of Crimea with Russia was also welcomed warmly by the whole Russian society, except of the most minority of some opposition politicians. But it's natural. We are a democratic society, and everybody has a right to have and express his or her own opinion. You mentioned Crimea. So if you have time, let me remind you on what happened in Crimea, on what happened in Crimea. In Crimea, the population of this region, which historically is populated by ethnic Russians, mostly. There are Tatars, there are Ukrainians, of course, but the majority of populations are ethnic Russians. And they could not agree. They did not agree with the armed coup d'etat in Kiev in February 2014. And they decided that they have nothing to do with the authorities in Kiev who seized power by toppling legitimate president of the country. And they decided that they should have nothing to do with the government, which started pursuing apparently Russophobian policy, including attempts to prohibit use of Russian language in Ukraine, including Crimea. We all know very well, and we all remember very well, that Ukrainian extremists and radicals and neo-Nazis planned violence, planned use of force against Crimeans in February 2014. And this is why the Crimean parliament, which by the way was elected by the Ukrainian law, Ukrainian parliament voted to hold a referendum. And referendum showed that, as far as I remember, 97% of those who participated in a referendum voted for rejoining Russia. So it was the will of people of Crimea in accordance with international law. Why? Because international law and UN relevant conventions say that any people has a right for self-determination, and its right should be respected by the governments, because a sovereign state should have a government that represents rightful interests of all ethnical groups, nations, confessions living in this or that state. And apparently in February 2014, there was no government in Ukraine which would represent rightful interests of all ethnic groups and confessions in Ukraine, because this government tried to prohibit use of Russian language, which is a native language for at least 10 million of Ukrainian citizens. So the situation is not that simple as it is sometimes described by the Western countries, governments and Western media. Situation is much more complex, and the Crimeans, the people living in Crimea, in my view, they were forced by the irresponsible policy of the Kiev government, they were forced to conduct referendum for rejoining Russia.
So now move to the issue about migrants in Europe. Europe is now struggling with the worst migrant crisis since World War II. How does this affect Russia?
Well, first of all, if we talk about current migrant crisis in Europe, we should clearly see the reasons that caused this crisis. The reasons are and we mentioned it above during our conversation, the reasons are in the policy of interference conducted by the West in Libya, in Iraq, now in Syria. You know that the influx of the migrants or refugees or migrants to Europe started not this year, it started long before. What is needed, in our view, to settle this migrants crisis is to take political measures in Syria, in Iraq, and in Libya to normalize situation there. So there will be no migrants flow to Europe from these countries. And there will be no necessity to build refugee camps in European countries. I wouldn't say that there are many migrants from Syria in Russia now. Maybe several thousands of them tried to enter Europe through Russian-Norwegian border. But it doesn't mean that Russia doesn't know what the migrant problem is. For example, after the conflict and in fact civil war started in Ukraine, Russia received approximately 1 million of refugees from Ukraine. And we helped these people who faced really a tragedy in their own country. We helped our Ukrainian brothers to settle in Russia in refugee camps equipped in accordance with the highest international standards, in sanatoriums, in houses of Russian people. We are helping them to get jobs in Russia, in various regions of Russia. So we know what a migrant crisis is. We know what a refugee crisis is. And our experience is very significant in this area of significant experience of receiving refugees, of settling them, of helping them to settle in, of helping them obtain jobs, etc. And we can share this, our experience, with the European Union. Actually, we offer this to European Union, but we do not see any positive reply. But again, the most effective means to stop migrant crisis in Europe is to settle problems in the countries which are the biggest source of migrants and refugees to Europe. And we hope that above-mentioned Russian-American agreement on the modalities, on the terms of cessation hostilities in Syria will be effective from this point of view also.
So with the relations between Russia and the West and the lowest point right now, does it make Russia turn towards Asia?
Russia is an Asia-Pacific state for centuries, as you know. So it is apparent that the policy of the West caused worsening of Russian-West relations. But our attention to the Asia-Pacific region, our growing attention to the Asia-Pacific region is not linked directly to the worsening relations with the West, because, as I mentioned, for centuries, Russia has been a part of the Asia-Pacific, of greater Asia-Pacific region, Greater East Asia. Actually, we started policy of stimulation, of broadening and deepening of our relations with the Asia-Pacific region long before the current worsening of our relations with the West. Just one historic example. I'm also ambassador to the Republic of Kiribati. It's a group of islands in the Pacific Ocean. And the Kiribati is the local pronunciation of the name of Gilbert's. Mr. Thomas Gilbert, a British navigator who actually discovered these islands in 18th century. But they were given a name of Gilbert Islands back in 1820 by the Russian admiral, Mr. Krusenstern, who was sailing these waters at that time. That means that Russia was in the Asia-Pacific region, was in Pacific Ocean in 18th and 19th centuries and even before. So Russian involvement in the Asia-Pacific is very long and very deep. And of course, we see that the Asia-Pacific region is the most dynamic region in terms of economic development. It is one of the most advanced regions in terms of testing optimal integration models. Just look at ASEAN, just look at APEC, just look at EAS, just look at Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which members are Russia, China, Kazakhstan, and others, and other countries of Central Asia, Mongolia.
And India and Pakistan are very close to joining SCO, the SCO. Just look at Eurasian Economic Union, which members are Armenia, Belarus, Kyrgyzia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzia, and Russia. It is a very huge space from Baltics in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east. So, and we want to be a part of these Asia-Pacific integration processes, including possibility of establishment of economic partnership between Eurasian Economic Union, ASEAN, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That is what my president, President Putin, proposed in his address to the Russian Parliament in December 2015, and that is one of the main items we would like to discuss at Russia-ASEAN Summit, which is going to take place next May, in May 2016, in the city of Sochi in Russia, on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of Russia-ASEAN Dialogue Partnership.
One more question. I forgot to mention it on the paper, but how do you see the Kurds in Syria and reconciliations?
The role of Kurds? The Kurds fighting against ISIS are one of the most effective forces to fight terrorism in Syria and Iraq, and we cooperate with the Kurds. And as far as I know, the United States of America also cooperates with the Kurds, and we think it is really irresponsible that Turkey is trying to prevent Kurds from participation in inter-Syrian dialogue, to prevent Kurds from participation in fighting ISIS. It's a very irresponsible policy.